Welcome, Will Barlow, to Restitutio, to another follow-up, our final follow-up for Scripture and Science. So glad to have you here today.
Thanks, Sean. It's been fun talking with you about all this stuff.
Well, let's talk about the class as a whole. You have been through now 16 sessions, and of course, I know you recorded this some time ago, but we've just been putting it out on the podcast, and so you've had the initial comments by the people that attended live, and then those who watch on YouTube, maybe you had some comments come in there or conversations with others, and then through Restitutio, a few more people have gotten in touch. So just as an overall, were you satisfied with it? What would you say about the class as a whole?
Yeah, I was very thankful. We produced the class and I taught the class during a period of time where I was, not a full-time pastor. And so I was doing research, late at night, basically the whole week to try to get prepared for that Sunday. And then we would tape 3 sessions on Sunday. So I did an hour and a half of teaching 5 Sundays in a row. And the last one I did 4 hours. I did the last 4. And so I did 2 hours, 4 sessions, 2 hours. And so, would I, in a perfect world, have had more time to work on things and fact check things? Yes, I would have loved to, but thankfully, I've researched this stuff a lot, and I was able to pick up a lot of stuff from before, and then sort of look at stuff that's come out in the last 5 or 10 years, different quick little things I could look into and peek on, and make sure that my thinking on it was still pretty much, what modern science has to say on it. And so overall, I feel really good about it. There were definitely some things I wish I had a tiny bit more time. We'll talk about that in a little bit, I think, where I misspoke or where I didn't quite have the time to fact check things I would have liked to. But here's the thing. I'm not perfect. I'm not going to present myself to anyone as being perfect. I'm going to make mistakes. And so given the fact that I'm human and that I make mistakes and that my specialty really is one out of the 3 disciplines I was trying to present, I feel pretty good about the whole class.
Yeah. Well, the thing is too, if you had done all the work to, read all the journal articles that have come out since, the last time you were in school or whatever, and really had gotten the class cutting edge. Okay. Just wait 5 years. It'll be out of date again.
Totally.
So I think a lot of that is kind of like a fool's errand, and really what you were dealing with was approaches rather than specifics a lot of times. And really the class was giving people a lay of the land and sharing these different options in a non-judgmental way so that people would be informed and be able to make their own choices, which I think is a really fresh approach to apologetics in general and science apologetics in particular. You don't find people in a camp, whether they're gap theory people or young earth people or like old school, old earth, Hugh Ross types, or the John Walton, hipsters. You don't see them saying like, oh, well, this other position has some good points on this.
Right.
Like nobody does that. So I think in that sense, this class was really a fresh contribution to the field. And I think you're to be commended on that, because it really is an appropriate starting point and introduction to people for this kind of subject. Now, you did mention some corrections when we were talking about what to do this episode on, this follow-up episode. And you mentioned Stanley Miller. Of course, Miller-Urey did their experiment in 1953, which means that it's now 70 years old. And they allegedly created life in a test tube. Although if you read I was just looking at the Wikipedia article on it, and it's just like, it doesn't actually say that.
Right.
But like everyone talks about it as if that's what they did.
Correct.
So I know you wanted to speak on that a little bit. So what would you like to say?
Well, yeah, really, just real quick, my inspiration with sending you that was I was thinking about Pardon the Interruption, the ESPN sports show growing up, and one of the things that they do, these guys are talking off the cuff about all the sports trivia and stuff, and so they're sports experts, but they're going to get dates wrong, they're going to get teams wrong, they're going to get players' last names wrong or something, And so at the end of every segment, every 30-minute show, they'd bring out one of their friends, and they called him Stat Boy. And Stat Boy, they'd say, Stat Boy, where did we mess up? And Stat Boy would tell them, hey, this was a clean episode. Or he'd say, hey, you messed this up, you messed that up, you messed the third up. So yeah, I want to Stat Boy myself here and say there were 3 things I got feedback on that I thought were really important clarifications. And the first one is the Stanley Miller piece. And I said the same thing that many people say, which is I oversimplified it and said that experiment produced life. And the actual truth is, and this was pointed out by a comment on YouTube, I believe, was that it produced amino acids, which are some of the building blocks of life. But the problem is that the amino acids produced in the experiment were not the right ones, even though they were the right ones to produce life. Amino acids have an orientation called chirality, and the way that they were produced did not have the right chirality for life. There's right-handed and left-handed, and again, I'm not a biologist, not an expert, and I think some of the things that you've been promoting on Restitutio by James Tour talks about a lot of this stuff, and it's a really big obstacle to abiogenesis theories, is this idea of chirality and what can we do naturally versus what would look like a miracle, essentially. And so I just wanted to clarify that I oversimplified it by saying it produced life. It didn't produce life. It produced amino acids, and they were the wrong chirality. And that was an excellent point from one of our friends online.
Yeah. This is really something that I have been familiar with for a long time. I think the Answers in Genesis people had spoken on this chirality issue, left-handed versus right-handed, and how in nature they're produced evenly, even numbers of left and right. And I think for DNA, they have to just be one way or the other. And same thing, I think, for RNA. And so you need some sort of naturally occurring sorting mechanism to filter out one of the two that naturally occurs. And I don't think anyone's even come close to cracking that nut.
No.
And I do appreciate James Tour. He's a bit of a sensationalist. But that kind of works in our cultural milieu right now, to be just sort of like, can you believe this? And sort of outraged, right? Which is entertaining. So anyhow, I posted his interview with Eric Metaxas, which happened in Texas. I actually was going to go to it. My brother-in-law and I were going to go, but we thought it was going to be in New York City, but then they did it in like Houston, and that's just not driving distance for us Yankees.
No.
So, he's really got some good stuff, and kind of like just exposing this sense of overconfidence that origin of life scientists, walk around with. They're like, oh, we got this thing solved, or we're just about to. And he's like, dude, you've been saying that for 70 years and you have nothing. You can't even make a cell membrane. Forget about the stuff that goes inside. A cell membrane. Show me how you make it. And then even if, and this is another important point on this, even if scientists, let's say in 1,000 years, were able to make, with nanotechnology or something, right? Let's say they were able to make life, make a cell membrane, make a DNA, make mitochondria, all the different parts, organelles and so on, cytoplasm, whatever that is. They made all the stuff, right? And it even came to life. All that would prove is that intelligent beings can create life. That's all. It wouldn't prove, so I don't know. It seems like kind of like a silly point, but I appreciate that correction. What about the AM/FM thing? I know that came up too.
Yeah, we got an email from a friend of ours from the other side of the world, actually. I believe it was New Zealand. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think you're right about that.
Yeah, and he said that what I said about radio waves was wrong. And I think I was overgeneralizing that AM waves are longer wavelength and FM are shorter wavelength. And what he was saying is that, really it's a difference in technology. There's a lot of things you can do. They can be all over the frequency spectrum, all over the wavelength spectrum, and you can do all sorts of stuff with it. But really, the difference in how we perceive radio waves, how they sound to us, has to do with the technology that's being used. And I thought that was an important point because, again, I don't want to. I'm, again, former science and math educator. We don't want to perpetuate misconceptions, and I was perpetuating a very commonly held misconception that I was taught in school, And so, I want to, if I can help end that, then I'm going to help end that. So,
yeah. And then you also talked about population growth and the children of Israel. What was that all about?
yeah, so there are several places in the Bible, and this is actually a well-known issue. I just didn't have the time to double check my numbers right before I went in to teach it. But there are several places in the Bible where it talks about like 400 years or 430 years that the children of Israel were in Egypt, in between the story of Joseph and in Moses coming and taking them out of the land of Egypt. And so I use 300 years as an estimate. And that's because if you look at the genealogies, I think in the teaching, I said something like 130 years is what you get from the genealogies. And that's wrong. You actually get like 215 years from the genealogies. Mm-hmm. So you have the genealogies that say 215 years, and then you have, these other sections that may include longer periods of time, and it's 400. So I just sort of rounded it. I sort of picked a medium spot at 300 for the purposes of making the calculation, which I think is fair. In terms of actually what I think is the truth, what the real number really is, I actually do lean toward the shorter number, 215 years. And I think, Answers in Genesis actually has a pretty decent article on it, talking about if we count the time where they were in Egypt or under Egypt's authority or under Egypt's disdain, maybe even, they said figuratively you could start that all the way back at Ishmael, who was the son of an Egyptian. Abraham, Hagar was an Egyptian. So yeah. Some Bible scholars say, hey, that's sort of where that 430-year period starts. And then if you do that and you count through the genealogies, you get 430 years and 215 years approximately from Joseph and his death to Moses. So, I'm not putting a definitive answer out here. The whole point of the comment was 300 years is a reasonable middle road between all the different interpretational options we've got, whether it's 215 or 400 or 430. The point remains that the population growth that the Israelites saw during this period of time was 100 to 200 times better than what the Egyptians saw. And if that's true, we still end up with a small Israelite population of like 20, 30,000 people.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean that number stuff is pretty fascinating because there are logistical difficulties the more people you have.
Correct. Yep.
And I'm sure you feel that now that you have a third child, who's
Absolutely.
in diapers, and
absolutely, yeah.
The more people you have, the more logistics you have to consider, the more mouths you have to feed, the more waste there is, which is a major issue people don't think about too much. This is all very important. And there when it comes to that Hebrew word, I think it's the word translated 1,000. And there is some ambiguity with that. I haven't looked into it much myself, but I had heard that other places before you mentioned. I was like, yeah, I've heard that before. I don't know if that's a really big point or not. I'd have to look into it more myself. But again, this class is introducing people to what the issues are and what the potential solutions are. And there were multiple times. Usually, you would offer multiple options, not just one option to explain it. And my Uncle Jimmy was studying this 430 years versus 210 years years ago. And he stumbled upon a difference, I think, in the Septuagint.
Oh, yeah.
And there was one scripture. There are a couple of different verses, so I don't know if this solves everything. But one of them said, the days of their sojournings in Canaan, as well as in Egypt, was 430.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
So which is the same time frame you just suggested with the Ishmael idea.
Yeah.
And I think we have to keep in mind that the Masoretic text is incredibly good, but it's not flawless. It's something that I think, as time goes on, we'll get better translations. We'll get better, more courageous Old Testament scholars that are less, concerned with tradition and more concerned with truth. And we'll do better with this. But sometimes the Septuagint does give us older readings for things, and that might be something to consider on this. But in this last episode that you just covered, what do we call that? Science in the Bible. I think that's what you called it. Science in the Bible.
Yeah.
This it really gets at the nub of the main issue that so many of us Bible believing Christians face, which is what in the world do we do when the Bible appears to endorse a scientific view that by today's standards is just inaccurate or impossible? And this is really a hard question. You talked about your way into the subject was the flat Earth, which it still blows my mind that this it became a movement in recent times. But there are verses in the Bible that seem to suggest or imply that the Earth is flat, and so people say, "Well, the Bible says it. I believe it. That settles it." So, cover with us a couple of the different ways you can work with this.
Yeah, so I think one way is to think about sort of like our view of the Bible or bibliology. Is it a book? Is it one book, or is it a collection of books? And in other words, does it represent the mind of God only, or does it show us the mind of God through lenses of different human perspectives? And I think if we start there, then we can say things I think scholars are more comfortable saying about stuff like flat Earth, where it's like, well, maybe this guy, as recorded in the book of Job, thought that there was a solid dome over the Earth, or maybe this person here thought that there was a flat Earth or something like that. But that doesn't mean that God necessarily endorses that view, or that even though it's in the Bible and we view it as inspired on through the whole range of inspiration, but you and I both have a strong view of inspiration. Even though it's inspired, how much of that perspective is like an objective God perspective, and how much of it is in the worldview, in the lens of the person who's receiving that revelation, or who's writing down whatever they're writing down. And so I think that's sort of like the first layer. And
well, there's also some genre stuff. I mean, if we're going to go to Job is subversive wisdom. It's not even like traditional wisdom, like Proverbs, like you work hard, you do well in life. Job's like you work hard and sometimes life slaps you in the face.
Correct.
And then, of course, like at the end, God criticizes these speeches these other guys made anyhow.
Correct.
So cherry picking from Job is fraught anyhow.
Totally.
And then a lot of the other ones too that you brought up were from poetry, right? From Psalms and poetic sections of the prophets.
Yeah. And some of these words, like I think the one where it talks about the earth is a circle or something like that, and people, but like that word only gets used like 2 or something 3 times maybe in the Bible, that Hebrew word. And so it's like, how are we pressing so hard on a word that gets used 2 or 3 times? We honestly don't really know what it means. If you look it up in a Bible dictionary, a lot of times they'll tell you it means circle or sphere. They'll even like grant you the 3-dimensional object perspective of it. Like maybe they meant this to be a word for sphere too. We just don't know. There are things that because we stand so far away from the text from a linguistic perspective and from a temporal perspective, we have to have a lot of humility when we come to the text, I think. And just be willing to say, look, we can't press too hard on what a modern person thinks of a circle, because we don't know if the ancients thought about circles, or if they imagined spinning a circle in 3 dimensions and they just used the same word for both and just understood based on the context. There are descriptions of things in the Bible that don't fit flat Earth, with the way that the sun, they talk about the sun coming up and all the way that the heavens work and things like that. And a lot of people have written papers about how, hey, the biblical theology is not a flat Earth theology. It's actually a spherical Earth theology, using some of these other things. But again, I wouldn't press hard on either, really honestly, from either perspective.
Right. Well, that's just one. The flat Earth is just one of a class of issues. Because what were the other ones? You had the dome over the Earth. The foundations of the Earth are fixed, or thinking with your guts.
Thinking with your guts. Yep.
Or your kidney as your brain, things like that. I think a lot of us are basically we feel the tension between, on the one side, saying, well, the Bible, I believe the Bible's true, so have to find some way to make an interpretive move here that will fit with what I know is true of modern science. Okay. Like, to my knowledge, there isn't a movement of like kidney thinkers, kidney brains, or something, like that's not a thing yet, right? So that's good. But like, so that's one, and that I think is really hard, hard to say for every single one of these things. Oh, it's metaphorical, it's metaphorical, it's metaphorical, and then arbitrarily to then say, oh, well, that's literal, over here, for stuff that agrees with us. So I think that's actually a very difficult task. And then on the other side, to just say, oh, well, let's just throw it out. Let's just say it's not inspired. Let's just say it's a bunch of fables. And kind of like the Jordan Peterson approach is to treat the Bible as myth. It amazes me that this is back, because this is kind of an 1800s liberal Protestant move that totally failed, and all those churches are either dead or on their way to becoming dead, because like it just doesn't work for life to say, oh, it's a bunch of moral myths. Like, what's a moral myth that we would tell? I can't think of one off the top of my head, but like the frog in the kettle, it slowly heats up, and like that's just a myth. It's not, that never happened. Right. So I don't know. I'm not really interested in either of those. And this fresh take you're bringing in from John Walton, where he says, let me just read the quote from that episode. This is episode or 16, class session 16. Yet we must notice that when God wanted to talk to the Israelites about their intellect, emotions, and will, he did not revise their ideas of physiology and feel compelled to reveal the function of the brain. Instead, he adopted the language of the culture to communicate in terms they understood. So that's from his book, The Lost World of Genesis 1. Talk about that a little bit, this fresh take on how we can solve this problem of scientific inaccuracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've put the nail on the head. I think people don't, and some people may initially not like this move because it feels like these other liberal scholarship moves. But I think the key difference in my mind, at least, is sort of where is it going? Like, what's the end point? Because if you're using liberal scholarship, a lot of times, like you said, the end point is you view this as moral myths, and you just sort of say, well, maybe this happened, maybe it didn't, but we can sort of learn a lesson from it, and you can make some nice sermons out of that. But at the end of the day, like you said, you're not gonna lead a movement. People aren't going to get impassioned to follow God and to follow Christ if that's how they view the Bible. And so what Walton is saying is not this is a myth, but it's not, we should ignore it. What he's saying is that this language fits in a specific context. And I think, we understand this in our language in our time too, that if I use the phrase like raining cats and dogs, a person 2,000 years from now reading like an English text that says something about raining cats and dogs, they might be tempted to think, well, during that time, maybe there were like dogs that flew from the skies or cats that flew. I mean, they'd have to really think about, right? They'd have to work through that. And in working through that, they'd realize, oh, what they mean is that it's raining really hard. And so that, we all fit into our own environment, our own language, our own time frame, our own worldview. We're all bound by those things, whether we like it or not. So what Walton is saying is, if we want to understand the text of the Bible, we can't just translate the text. We also have to jump back as much as we can into a time machine and try to immerse ourselves in their worldview and do it charitably. I think a lot of times, people are tempted to jump to a conclusion one way or jump to a conclusion another way, and not realize that what they're doing is they're not taking the text as charitably as they could. And so I think what Walton's doing is he's providing us a pathway to think about things. And again, we're not going to do this perfectly because, again, we're 3,500 years removed from the text temporally, and then of course we've got the cultural pieces as well and the linguistic pieces. But to do the best that we can to be charitable to the text. And I think his point is a good one. If you're God and you understand how people work and you understand what their worldview is, you have to make a decision whether you're going to reveal to them in ancient Hebrew in their language, like this is the real truth. Like we have things called brains and they're squishy and they're inside your head, so protect your head. And like he could have done that, and maybe he tried to do that, and the biblical authors just didn't understand it, couldn't figure it out or whatever. Or maybe he didn't because of what Walton's saying here, where he's working within what they understand. So I think anyway, that provides us with a way forward instead of just saying, hey, we're going to take this literally. I don't think you can take anything literally unless we try to put ourselves inside the biblical culture and their mindset, their framework.
Yeah. So I think you've got I'm trying to think, like maybe three or so different ways to do things with science in the Bible. Like one of them is to say the Bible is always right on the surface, prima facie.
Yep.
And so if it contradicts science, science is just wrong. There's a conspiracy in NASA, Google, and SpaceX, and Virgin, and like there's so many of these, like
in the ancient Greeks. I mean, the ancient Greeks figured out that the world was round.
Like 20 years ago, this stuff might work because there was just NASA and it was like a government-owned thing, and you'd be like, oh yeah, they're just really trying to work against the Bible. But like at this point, people are launching satellites all the time, and it doesn't. It's hard to maintain that level of conspiracy theory over a lifetime. So like that's the idea of saying, like, just take everything at face value, and if it contradicts, then everyone else is wrong. Another option is to say, oh well, it's all metaphor and myth anyhow, but then like you've got a metaphorical resurrection of Jesus, and you've got a metaphorical afterlife and salvation. Everything is just sort of like culture at that point. And maybe that's satisfying for the parents, but the kids are not going to buy it typically. And then you've got this other position, which is, all right, well, in every case where the Bible seems to say that you think with your kidneys or your intestines, there must be another explanation. And that, I think, is the most work intensive of all these views.
Yeah.
But you're not saying any of those. What you're saying, and what Walton's saying here, is that it's okay to say the Bible's wrong about science, and to say at the same time the Bible is true and inspired. That's a really weird position. You're trying to have your cake and eat it too.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
I think so. Yeah.
You want to say, okay, God inspired this, and he communicated to them in ways that we know are not accurate descriptions of the way the universe works.
Right.
And that's okay. Because why?
Because he sees where they are in their, I mean, it's the same thing morally, right? I mean, he offers them in Genesis 2, he offers them man and woman, one man and one woman, that's a marriage. Then later he lets them have multiple wives. At one point, even says, hey, I would have given you another wife. I forget if it's David or Solomon. I think it's David. He said, hey, I would have given you another wife if you asked for another wife. That wasn't God's intention. We get to the New Testament, we see very clearly, it's one man, one woman. That was God's intention from the beginning. And Jesus pushes on that, and Paul pushes on that multiple times. And so again, you have this people. This people is in a context, a framework, and they're pushed on by the world around them. They're pushed on by the Egyptian way of viewing astronomy. They're pushed on by the Babylonian way of looking at astronomy. They're pushed on by morals and ethics from all these different parts of the world. And God, it seems like, consistently works with them sort of where they are and tries to shepherd them where he wants them to go. And I think, honestly, that's a more gracious and merciful view of God and how he works through our weaknesses than the alternative perspectives on the Bible and science, or the Bible and morality, or the Bible and whatever other hot button subject you want to push.
Yeah. What's interesting about this approach, and I don't know if we have a name for it, but what's interesting about it is that it takes the Bible more literally, because it's like, yeah, that's what they thought, and they were wrong, and it's okay, because that's not the point. The point is like, okay, so the earth is like fixed on foundations. What's the point of that? The point is it's stable.
Right.
God's got it. Like you're still, whatever the phenomenological expression is, is communicating a point.
Right.
And I have to be careful not to mythologize or de-mythologize here, because I'm not trying to go down that road. But yeah, it's really a fresh take, an interesting take, a lot to think about here. And John Walton, I think, he doesn't really satisfy me. I read his book, Lost World of Genesis 1, I think is the first book he wrote on this subject, or at least the popular one. And I remember reading it like, maybe, and like he makes a lot of moves that I'm like, I wasn't comfortable to make with him. But to say that he has no point at all, I mean, I don't think that's reasonable, especially with this thing, brain being your kidneys and all that stuff. It's like, that's uncontestable. Like, what are you going to do with that?
Right. Yeah.
So I think there's definitely something here for us to consider and to look into. Did you ever see the diagram his son drew of the ancient cosmology? So his son has this diagram, and it's like a disc, and then there's like the chaotic waters around the disc, and then there's this like mythical, I don't know, Rahab or Leviathan sea creature that's like swimming around out there. And then, there's the dome, and, it's got these different layers and stuff. And, his son did like a whole illustration of what he thought the ancient Near Eastern view, not just the biblical view, but the ancient Near Eastern view was. And, I was like, that's really interesting. So like our default as 21st century modern people is to think of the earth, like you pointed out in the beginning, as being off planet and looking at the earth.
Correct.
But the ancients just didn't have the way to do that. Everything is described as phenomena, as experienced from the perspective of somebody here. So the sun goes around the earth. It does go around the earth. We see it. I can watch it do it.
Correct. Right? Yeah.
So, but then scientifically we're saying, oh, that's false. Okay. It's false from the perspective of someone not on the earth.
Right.
From someone not on the earth, from somebody like on Pluto or something. It's not even a real planet anymore. Let's just go with Venus or Mars. From the perspective of somebody on Mars, because I don't think you can even stand on Venus. It's a little gas, isn't it? So say you're on Mars, you can actually watch the earth go around the sun. The sun does, so from where you're standing, it changes the description of what it is you see.
Correct.
So I think both are right. It's just a matter of perspective. Well, let's end up on a positive note here, Will.
All right.
Let's talk about some of these scientific accuracies, like Leviticus. What would you say your favorite one is out of the whole list? Was the circumcision? I think you kind of mentioned that.
Yeah, I mean, circumcision is remarkable because here you have an ancient text, and you have, I mean, I don't even know honestly what the atheist or agnostic response to this would be. I don't know if you would think that maybe Moses conducted a scientific experiment where they cut foreskins on day 1. Oh nope, the baby bled out. Well, let's try again day 2. Let's do day 3. Like how like there's literally no historical or scientific like justification for that kind of an approach. And what we have God commanding them to do it on the day when the vitamin K levels are naturally the highest. And so to me, I mean, that just seems like an incredible testimony to the inspiration of Scripture. And I think the other one that I really like a lot is also from the Levitical law, and that is I think something that I heard from probably from one of your teachings a while back, honestly, which was this idea that Moses was steeped in Egyptian culture, and he would have learned their medicine, and he would have learned, and you pointed out, I think, some of the books, you can Google it and read them, and they're throwing poop in and infected wounds and
The
they're
urine of a faithful wife,
right.
stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Which I mean, I guess the urine of a faithful wife, at the end of the day, that might not hurt you terribly, but I think the dung is the more important one there with all
Yeah.
the bacteria and
Yeah.
dung. But anyway, the point is that he would have grown up. He would have had, just getting back to what Walton was saying, he would have grown up with a medical system. He would have grown up with vocabulary. He would have grown up with way to treat all these different illnesses. And what comes out of it is not what we would have expected. We would have expected something that sounds a lot like these Egyptian books on medicine. What we
Yeah.
got is essentially what we did during COVID-19 in 2020. We got quarantines, we got
Mhm.
ritual cleansings, we got, all these different things. And I think, again, unbelievably remarkable. And there's no way, it doesn't matter how liberal a scholar you are, you're not going to date the Torah any younger than 2,500 years old. It doesn't matter how liberal you are. This
Yeah.
is a 2,500-year-old document. I believe it's a 3,500-year-old document.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. The point is that we didn't understand these things about germ theory until the last 150 years.
Right.
We didn't understand this thing about vitamin K until the last, I don't know, 80, 90 years. I don't even know.
Mhm.
Anyway, it's been medicine in the last 100, 150 years has validated this. So what I'm saying is Martin Luther couldn't have been excited about these things that we're talking about.
Wow.
That's how recent this stuff is. And so again, you just look at how inspired is the scripture. Well, we're finding out that some of the things that it says scientifically was true 3,500 years ahead of its time.
Yeah.
And I don't think you have another ancient text that does that.
No. The book to consider on that is called None of These Diseases by Macmillan and Stern, I think is the book that I kind of depended on for that material. And they talk about the Ebers papyrus and the various potions in it.
Yeah.
And what I find so remarkable in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy and so forth is that I can only think of one potion in the whole law code, and it's trial by ordeal, okay? And it's kind of like theater, and it's where you have a jealous husband,
right? Yep.
Right, and he has and the potion is write out a curse on parchment or papyrus or something, and then wash it off into a container and take some dust from the ground of the tabernacle and put it in and have her drink it.
Yeah.
And this is going to be harmless. Like she's going to be fine. Like there's no problem. But if her belly swells and she has all this this Hebrew's pretty obscure. Her belly swells and her thigh wastes away, right?
Right. Yeah.
Then you know that she's committed adultery. Okay. Well, if God doesn't perform a miracle,
correct,
that's not going to happen.
Correct. Yeah.
So like the only potion that I can find is, first of all, not related to health or medicine.
No.
And second of all, totally innocuous and would require a miracle to do something bad to you, which would be the indicator that you're looking for. So pretty obscure reference there. Sorry, I went in that direction.
No, I think it's great. No, I think it's a great point. Yeah.
Where are all the potions? Why don't we have any potions? Everybody use potions.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of quarantine. There's a lot of hey, take a look at the skin and see if the infection has spread. See if mold is spreading in a house. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. Seems suspiciously modern. So I think in the end, what I hear you saying is that when it comes to science and the Bible, God doesn't overwrite or revise their scientific understanding. Typically, He just works from within it. And he works within their language and he works within their social norms. And yet at the same time, he does know the science. So without any explanation. He will make laws for their good when it
Correct.
comes to like public health.
Yeah.
And he will install or put in the thinking that he has without, and he doesn't explain it.
Right.
It's just kind of like it all just fits together. Because I think one of the criticisms coming away from that last episode, Will, that people could say is like, oh, Will, on the one hand, you're saying, oh, it's okay to have all these inaccuracies.
Right.
And then on the other hand, you're saying, but because there are all these accuracies, we know it's inspired. So I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, well, I think if you're going to apply Walton's rule, you got to apply it both ways. I think that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be consistent here. And what I'm saying is, going back to Moses's medical theories, and we would have expected if he was completely on his own writing the book of Leviticus, we would have expected the book of Leviticus to read a lot like that papyrus you're talking about, simply because that is his worldview. That is his,
right.
That's where he came from. So what I'm saying is that, and I think you made the critical point, which is God does intervene in ways to change and to amend people's understanding of things when it comes to public health, or when it's an immediate concern. And you have to remember that when Moses was writing this down, they were in the wilderness in an incredibly difficult public health situation. There was no running water. There was no sanitation. You had to deal with all these things on a very practical level. And God, as a good shepherd, took care of his people. And so what I'm saying is, if you apply the same methodology that Walton would do here, he'd say that God did intervene, but he did intervene for a specific reason. That reason was to help his people survive and to thrive in the wilderness, and then eventually in the promised land. And so I think I'm trying to use the same rule both ways. I'm saying that there is a worldview. There are things that they would have thought about. There are things but then there are times when there are these lightning bolts from heaven where God does reveal amazing things through the text of the Bible that you really just can't explain any other way. There's no way that would have been what they would have understood in the ancient world, especially given the immediate captivity that they'd had in Egypt.
Yeah.
And
well,
so
another,
I'm
another
trying to
one.
be consistent.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying I'm trying to be consistent with Walton's rule there.
Yeah. That helps. That explanation helps. Another one that you didn't touch on is the clean and unclean animals.
Mm-hmm.
And some people have made a big deal about that there's a lot of these animals that naturally carry disease, especially if they are not butchered in a way that leads right into refrigeration.
Right.
With modern technology, we can eat a lot of things that ancient people would just not have messed around with, because they would go bad too quickly, or they would have other diseases that we have ways of counteracting even while the animal's alive, with antibiotics and whatnot.
Yep.
So, that's like a public health thing too.
Absolutely.
That some people make a big deal out of. But I hear what you're saying. I think if you on face value, it seems like you're just you're kind of like a magician, and you're showing one hand, but in the other hand you're doing something else, right? Like, oh, it's okay here, but like here we're really good. But that's just like on the surface level. Like when you really think about it, what you're saying is like, all right, take it from the perspective of God. Don't take it from the perspective of a Christian or an atheist. Take it from a perspective of God, dealing with primitive Bronze Age people that have potions in their medical knowledge arsenal, and have no idea that the earth even revolves around this. They don't even know that. So now you're gonna make a people. You're gonna take them out of Egypt. You're gonna establish laws for them. Is this the time to tell them that at a very small scale, electrons can sometimes tunnel because of a quantum state? Is this the time to tell them that? Is this the time to tell them that, we're really rotating and that's day and night as opposed to the sun going? What would be the point of telling them that? Information that for millennia would just cause people to doubt the truthfulness of Scripture. Because everybody knows it's the other way, even though they're wrong, right? So like, if you take it from the perspective of God, then it's like, okay, so you're going to have these lightning bolts where you bring them forward, but you're not going to explain it because they couldn't handle it anyhow. It wouldn't make any sense because they just don't have the the ground laid to have germ theory yet.
Correct.
Right? So yeah, I think it works. I think it works. It's a really fascinating take. It's a hot take. I like it. Any other final thoughts before we close out this video?
No, just I'm thankful for all that watched and all that watched our follow-up videos and who interacted with me either on Facebook or on Restitutio's website or on YouTube. I really do appreciate it. I did read all the feedback and wrote back to a lot of it. I didn't write back to all of it, but I did read it all. I can promise you that. And but I've really enjoyed engaging with different people during this time. And I'm super thankful to you, Sean, for your friendship and for Restitutio, for the mission of Restitutio, and for the small path forward we could bring with science and scripture with this class. So
yeah, and I'm certainly and I think I speak for a lot of us, very thankful for your hard work on this because this was a volunteer effort and it was really a blessing to a lot of us. So thank you.
Thanks, Sean.